Chomsky, and dear participants, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Welcome to our very special webinar on emergence of new world post-COVID-19. And to speak on this issue, we have very special guest, Professor Noam Chomsky. It is my privilege to welcome Professor Chomsky on behalf of NICE and all our participants from 25 countries who are watching us from Zoom, Facebook Live, and YouTube. There were around 1,000 registered participants who are watching us via Zoom and Facebook. Professor Chomsky, we are really honored to have you with us, and we heartily welcome you to our program. I think there is no English word to express this special feeling of mine. Thank you, sir, for a valuable time. This discussion is in memory of those millions of migrant workers of South Asia who walked alone on deserted roads, and to those who sacrificed their lives. They were citizens without a state, voters without their government, and migrant workers without owners. They did not complain, but walked. It made few ashamed of being citizen of that nation, ashamed of being human, and ashamed of being human of this 21st century. I think in one sense, COVID-19 was an eye-opener to all of us because it made us awake. It clearly it cleared many of our illusions, especially regarding state, security, government, scientific advancement, international order, media, and many others. Dear participants, today, every second is very precious to us. We can't afford to waste even a second. Hence, we directly move forward with our conversation with Professor Chomsky. I'd like to apologize for the delay. Professor Chomsky, the first question for today is, what kind of world order are we going to witness post-COVID-19? Is it going to be a China-dominated world order?
So, what kind of world will emerge depends on decisions that are made. We are now in a situation which is somewhat similar to 17 years ago, 2003. At that point, there was a major coronavirus epidemic, the SARS epidemic. It was contained, but scientists informed us that another pandemic, probably worse, was very likely to come. They also explained what could be done about it, what kind of preparation should be taken. Essentially, nothing was done. And there were reasons for that. We have to explore those reasons because they still hold today. And if we don't answer those problems, a worse pandemic will recur, almost certainly. Scientists are saying the same things today. So what happened? It was known how to proceed, but it's not enough to have knowledge. Someone has to use it. Who could use it? Well, there's the major drug companies, huge resources, enormous profits, great laboratories, they could proceed. But they're prevented by something called capitalist logic. You don't invest in something that is not profitable. It's not worth spending money on to try to prevent a catastrophe that might happen in 10 years. So they don't do anything. Well, there's the government. The government, again, has great laboratories, enormous resources. The government is, in fact, responsible for most of the work on vaccines and drugs, most of the creative work, so they could have done it. But that's blocked by something else, the neoliberal principles, which say that government is the problem, not the solution, Ronald Reagan's famous words. So for 40 years, we've been living in a system which was announced by Reagan and Thatcher, then implemented by major private and government power centers for 40 years, and it essentially nullifies government. So very little was done. Something was done, but then you get particular cases in particular countries. So when President Obama was elected, he did, as soon as he was elected, the first days, he called there's a presidential scientific advisory council. He called it into session. He requested that they produce preparation program for preparing in case a pandemic comes, because it was anticipated. They did it. It was put into operation, and it lasted until January 2017, when President Trump came into office. And the first days in office, he dismantled it and started defunding the Center for Disease Control, as he did every year, canceled programs that were of American scientists working in China with Chinese scientists on coronaviruses. End result, when it finally came, the US was completely unprepared. Other countries responded, often very effectively. East Asia, Oceania, New Zealand has apparently eradicated it. Other countries have it under control. The US, the pandemic is raging. It's the worst in the world. It's gotten to the point where Europeans have wondered whether the United States has simply abandoned any effort to deal with it. Death rates are much higher than elsewhere. A report came out in one of the major medical journals just a few hours ago, estimating that probably 80 or 90% of the 100,000 deaths could have been avoided if the president and the government had taken any action. So putting it all together, we have three problems. One is capitalist logic, which blocks the drug companies. The other is the neoliberal programs, which have undermined government action. The third is actions of individual governments, of which the United States is far and away the worst. Brazil is not far behind, but other countries have done something or other, often effectively. And that's what we're facing for next time. So we know what to do with it. Problem is to do it.
Shall we go to the next question?
Yeah.
In the context of India, recently in an interview, you said, what we are seeing is the symptoms of fascism without the fascist ideology. What makes you think so, as India claims itself as the largest democracy in the world? Is it because India is housing millions of Muslim citizens after labeling them as illegal migrants?
Sorry, could you say it again?
In the context of India, recently in an interview, you said, what we are seeing is the symptoms of fascism without the fascist ideology. What makes you think so?
Sorry, say it again. What we're seeing is what?
What you're seeing is the symptoms of fascism without the fascist ideology regarding India.
Yeah, that's correct. I mean, we're seeing the fascist ideology was a serious notion way beyond President Trump's sophistication, or the sophistication of the other leaders around the world who are showing fascist symptoms. The fascist symptoms are things like advocating violence, racism, such things. But fascism was a serious ideology. It held that the entire society should be under the control of a political party, the Nazi party, the fascist party in Italy, which would be led by a maximal leader and would organize and control the entire society, including the business world, which was subordinated to the fascist state. That's not the world we live in. We live in almost the opposite world, where governments are subordinated to the business sectors. That's particularly true, say, for the United States. The business world essentially dominates the government. Trump's policy. Trump is tolerated by the business world, even though they don't like him, as long as he makes sure that the legislative programs, every one of his programs, benefits them. So if you take a look at the programs, not the rhetoric, but the programs that are actually implemented, like the big tax cut, corporate tax cut. Now, business is very happy about that. So they're willing to let him parade on the stage with his antics as long as he puts the dollars into the right pockets. Actually, there was a very dramatic example of that at the Davos meetings in January. Every January, the rich and powerful of the world, the masters of the universe, as they call themselves, gather in a Switzerland at an elegant ski resort to meet each other, congratulate each other on how wonderful they are and so on. This last meeting was interesting, January. Of course, they invited Trump to be the keynote speaker. They don't like him at all. His vulgarity and obscenity disrupts their effort to present themselves as humanistic and sophisticated and so on. So they don't like it. But they gave him rousing applause when because he described the programs he's carrying out, like benefits to corporation, enriching the very rich. As long as he does that, they'll tolerate the vulgarity and ugliness of his general performance. So it's not fascism. In fact, it's some different thing. And in fact, if you look closely, you have to look at the different countries. They're somewhat different. So in, say, the United States and Brazil, to take the two major countries in the Western Hemisphere, the governments are turning them into the kind of small-time dictators that you find in neo-colonial countries, small countries where there's a military coup every couple of years and a new dictator is put in, but the business world remains the same. That's what's happening. So Trump, for example, has virtually eliminated the executive branch of the government. There's no appointments anymore. He doesn't even send appointments to the Senate for confirmation, according. He just picks people who are going to obey him. One of the recent things he did was just what you get in a tin pot dictatorship, is he fired all of the inspectors general. These are people who are appointed by, designed by Congress to have inspectors who will investigate and monitor the departments of the government, the Treasury Department, the State Department, and so on, to make sure that there isn't corruption, malfeasance of one sort or another. They began looking into the swamp that Trump has created in Washington. So he just fired them all. It's a symptom of fascism, but it's not fascism. You find the same in Brazil. The parliament and the courts in Brazil are starting to look into the enormous corruption of President Bolsonaro's family. They fired the investigators. They didn't back down. They're still doing it. That's different from the United States. The court is still independent in Brazil. A military coup is threatened, may happen. The United States is a little different. Take a look at, say, Viktor Orban's Hungary. He's just turning it into a model of a dictatorship without affecting business domination and control. Again, fascist symptoms, but not fascism. Take a look at Modi's India right next to you. Pretty much the same story. Plenty, I don't have to tell you, you know better than I do. Plenty of fascist symptoms, but the centers of private power are kept in place. They're not under government control.
Recently, we heard about the tragic murder of Floyd in the United States. How do you look at this incident? Is it a mere accident, or incident or situation of Afro-American has not changed much. Your comment on it, Professor?
The Floyd
Yes,
demonstration.
yes.
It's very interesting. I mean, there have been police killings, severe police beatings before, and there were protests, but nothing remotely like this. The closest one is the Rodney King case about in 1992, 30 years ago. There were 6 days of protests. They finally had to call in federal troops to quell the disorder. 60 people were killed. It's a major protest. But it was in Los Angeles where it happened. Now it's totally different. It's all over the country, in fact, over much of the world. It has enormous public support, which is very unusual. About 2/3 of the public supports the protests. That's much more support than Martin Luther King received at the peak of his popularity. There's even support coming from the top military command. The 2 last chairmen of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, top military officers, both opposed Trump's call for violence and supported the protests. Nothing like this has ever happened. It's a sign of increasing consciousness. There are many other signs, and awareness of the horrors of 400 years of really vicious repression of Blacks, which has a bitter legacy. And it's very late, but there's some recognition of that. Now, what'll come out of it, we never know. I mean, there are proposals, demands for changes in police procedure, some efforts to go beyond to the much deeper problems which go way beyond police. A lot of police work is in the Black ghettos because these are high crime areas. Why are they high crime areas? Because people have no opportunities. They're suffering from a legacy of literally 400 years of repression. So yes, you get crime, then you get police, then you get police brutality, but you have to look at the sources, not the symptoms. And there's some moves in that direction, but I think it's a turning point. And in fact, if you think about the present moment, it's pretty astonishing. There's a kind of confluence of things that are coming together all at the same time. Terrible pandemic, huge protests all over the country. Global warming is extremely threatening and developing. There's this increasing threat of nuclear war, which is very threatening in your area. Global warming, if it continues on its present course, is going to make much of South Asia almost unlivable in a couple of decades. Pakistan and India are nuclear-armed states which will be struggling to obtain the reducing amounts of water. It's already very scarce as the glaciers melt and the rivers decline, both nuclear-armed. I mean, all of this together is just a recipe for complete disaster. Could happen soon in the next few decades. And it's all happening right now. It's all converging. It's an incredible moment of human history. And you are right on the fringes of it.
Let's move to next question. Nepal lies between 2 Asian giants, China and India. Both are economic and military power of Asia. One claims to be socialist while other a democrat. In this context, how can a small state like Nepal survive? What should be Nepal's foreign policy?
The one that claims to be socialist isn't socialist. The one that claims to be democratic has elements of democracy, but they're being demolished by the current government. the Modi government is essentially dismantling Indian secular democracy and turning it into a racist state. So yes, Nepal is in a difficult position. The two countries are, in fact, almost at war right now. And fortunately, the war has been over, the Ladakh area, Aksai Chin, and so on. The war has been kept to a low level so far, but it could burst out. It's what Nepal has to do is take care of its internal problems as best as possible and try to remain neutral when the elephants are fighting. It's not an easy position to be in.
Yes. Let's move to the next question, sir. Trump came with America first. Modi came with India first. There is a rise of nationalism in China and other parts of the world. Similar trend is seen even in small countries like Nepal. Do you see the chances of revival of fascism along with the values of muscular nationalism and fiscal conservatism in post-COVID-19 world? How is globalization going to be affected?
Well, I think we should look back to the effect of 40 years of neoliberalism. It's been quite harmful. Almost everywhere the policies have been applied. So for example, in the United States, by now, literally 0.1% of the population has over 20% of the wealth, and a large majority of the population is just getting by from week to week. You get a paycheck on one Friday, maybe you can get by for the next week, that's all. Nothing saved. The real wages are about what they were in the 1970s. Something similar has happened almost all over the world where the neoliberal programs have been applied one or another form. And it's left people angry, frustrated, resentful, easy terrain for a demagogue to come along and say it's somebody else's fault. It's the fault of the immigrants, the Muslims, the blacks, somebody, refugees, and that, people who are desperate can grab onto that, say, okay, let's close the borders. Let's just work for ourselves. Let's forget about the world. And you get these pathological symptoms like ultranationalism. But there are also forces combating them. And these forces are not insignificant. So for example, just a couple of weeks ago, there was the first public announcement of what's called the Progressive International organization. It was initiated by Bernie Sanders and his movement in the United States, by Yanis Varoufakis and his movement, DiEM25 in Europe. DiEM25 has been working to try to it's a transnational organization throughout Europe, working to try to preserve what is sensible and constructive in the European Union and to overcome the very serious flaws of the Union. So now they've united. They're going to have the first meeting in Iceland, a couple of months. The Prime Minister of Iceland is a member. They're bringing in the voices from the third global South, India, Africa, Pakistan, other countries. And it's an effort to try to form a unified international organization that will be able to confront the concentrated reactionary forces that are centered in the White House in the United States, but include Modi's India, the dictatorships of the Gulf, Orban's Hungary, other reactionary forces. And it's a question how effective it will be, but it's a promising development. It's important to remember that all of the major crises we face now are international. There cannot be a national response to the pandemic. New Zealand can get rid of the virus. As soon as it opens its borders, it's going to come back, and they can't live in isolation. Global warming is an international problem. Nuclear war, international problem. The racism, international. All international problems. Setting up borders just makes it harder and harder to try to deal with the crises. What we should be seeing is the erosion of borders, something like the move towards integration in Europe, which was limited, but was in the right direction. So you can go from one country in Europe to another to study, to work, and so on. In a sense, that already happened in the United States. The United States was plural, basically. It was a collection of states, different states interacting in one way or another. The Civil War turned it into in 1860, made it a unified country. It's now one country. You can go from one state to another, one country. If one state, say if Kansas happens to be suffering and can't deal with its economic problems, New York can help them survive. That's automatic in the federal system. Now, that's what the world ought to be like. It's very far from that, but that's where it should be moving.
The next question is, do you find government all over the world turning more authoritarian, anti-people, anti-human on the eve of pandemic? Do you think that the socialist alternative are more relevant?
Do we think that socialist policies would be relevant? Sorry, I didn't hear the question exactly. Could you say it again?
Do you think the world is turning more authoritarian, more anti-people, more anti-human? And do you think the socialist alternative are more relevant in days to come?
Actually, both things are happening. It's going in both directions. So, for example, there is as I said, a progressive international forming. It's based on very significant popular movements. In the United States, in Europe, they're quite active. There are such movements all over the world. Not a lot of attention is paid to them, but they're very real. So take, say, Brazil, which is moving towards military dictatorship. On the other hand, Brazil has the most, probably the largest and most effective popular movement in the world, the landless workers movement, an enormous movement, taking over for years. It's been taking over unused lands owned by major corporations or great landowners, taking them, settling them, building cooperative institutions based on agriculture, but also beyond, like dairy production, many other things, working to enter into the general market to serve the cities. So that's happening on the one hand, move toward dictatorship in the other. You see the same everywhere, almost anywhere you look. So the answer is things are going in both directions. The question is which will prevail. It's a major crisis. At the international level, there is on the one hand the progressive international. On the other hand, there's a reactionary international being crafted from Washington, the White House, the Trump administration, includes Bolsonaro's Brazil, Modi's India, al-Sisi's Egypt, Orban's the Gulf dictatorships, MBS in Saudi Arabia, Orban's Hungary. That's one constellation. Progressive international is another constellation. It's a major conflict that's going to determine the fate of the world.
The next question, sir. How has the foreign policy of United States transformed in the last 2 decades from Bush, Obama to Trump era? How the foreign policy has transformed?
Trump is a very unusual figure. He's unlike any president in American history. In fact, anyone ever in the parliamentary system. He basically has no policies and no ideology except himself. He's a narcissistic megalomaniac. He is solely after making sure that he can be gain political power and be enriched. He's a good politician. He understands how he can proceed. He has a primary constituency that he has to satisfy, or else they'll kick him out. Corporate power and private wealth. So he has to satisfy them, and he does. What I mentioned about Davis is an example. His legislative programs are an example. So all the programs that he implements have to serve them. But he has to be voted in, the political democracy. So he has to have a voting base. You can't come to people and say, I'm trying to destroy you, vote for me. That doesn't work. So you have to approach people on other grounds, what are called cultural grounds. So racism, xenophobia, religion, extremist religion. The United States is a very religious country. Christian evangelicals who care about nothing but, Jesus coming, are about 25% of the population. There's an enormous gun culture. A lot of people where I live in Arizona, you have to be able to carry your assault rifle into the local coffee shop, So appeal to people on those grounds. If you look at Trump's pronouncements when he's basically trying to instigate violence, every one of them, just notice, every one of them says you have to protect your Second Amendment rights. What's the Second Amendment rights? The right to walk into a coffee shop with your assault rifle. So that's telling people, I'm going to save your right to do that. I'm going to keep the immigrants out, these rapists and murderers that are coming from Mexico. I'm going to ensure that your pastors in church can be openly political in violation of the Constitution. So I'll give you all of those things, so vote for me. Meanwhile, I'll make sure that you're in the worst possible situation. It's a kind of what's called a confidence man. You have one hand stands up and says, I love you, I'm going to protect you. The other hand stabs you in the back. And so far he's gotten away with it pretty well. It's actually declining now. People don't have to read medical journals to know that the pandemic is being handled catastrophically. They don't know that 80 or 90% of the deaths were preventable. And it was Trump's malice that caused, 80 or 90,000 people to die. They may not know that, but they know something's going wrong, badly wrong. And his support is in fact declining. But it's a very uncertain situation. He could do, there are people in high places by now who are talking openly about the possibility that he might just declare martial law. Nothing like that's happened in American history. This is a unique situation without precedent. In fact, something similar is happening in England. England has 350 years of parliamentary democracy. It's not based on laws. Britain barely has a written constitution. It's based on trust and good faith, and that's being torn to shreds. When Boris Johnson closed he prorogued the parliament so that he could ram through his proposal for Brexit without parliamentary discussion. That was a gross violation of the whole constitutional order of 350 years. In fact, it was finally thrown out by the Supreme Court. But this attack on the basis of democracy in the two leading parliamentary democracies, England, 350 years, United States, 250 years. In both of them, the basic structure of democracy is being severely eroded. It's happening elsewhere, Brazil, Hungary, other countries. It's another very serious problem happening at the same time. I should maybe mention, as I presume you know, every January, the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, the main scientific journal that deals with security issues, every year they bring together leading scientists, political analysts, and do an assessment of the world situation, world security situation, and they encapsulate it in a clock called the Doomsday Clock, in which they set the minute hand a certain distance from midnight. Midnight means terminal disaster, we're finished. The clock was established in 1947 after the atomic bombings. It was set at 7 minutes to midnight. It's oscillated up and back over the years, set every January. When Trump came into office, it was moved forward towards midnight. Every year he's been in office, it's been moved further towards midnight. Last year, it reached the closest point it had ever reached. This year, it went beyond the closest point. In fact, they abandoned minutes and moved to seconds. And they had three basic reasons. One, the growing threat of nuclear war, quite serious. Trump has dismantled the arms control regime, which offered some protection. Building new weapons and so on, that's increasing. The second is global warming, which is a very severe threat. Don't have to go through the details, but it's extremely severe. And the third is decline of democracy. Those are the three major issues. It seems at first like they don't all fit together, but they do. Decline of democracy eliminates the only way there is to deal with the first two crises. Can only be dealt with by an informed, engaged public. So if that declines, the other crisis will just escalate. Now that's the world we're in. It's a very ominous situation. There's never been anything like it in human history.
So the next question is, what will be the fate of capitalism in post-COVID-19 world?
Well, I think that's again a matter of direct conflict right now. The forces who created the current system, who created the neoliberal system with all of its consequences, they're working very hard, relentlessly, every minute, to try to ensure that it remains, and it comes even in a harsher form, which more surveillance, more control, and so on. So again, take the Trump administration, most important government in the world dominant government. Right, every minute they are, under the cover of the pandemic, passing legislation which will make the situation harsher and more brutal. Just take the latest case, the labor secretary who's a corporate lawyer with a strong background of opposing labor rights. So naturally he's labor secretary. While nobody was looking, he passed a regulation that allows private equity firms to buy into the 401k system. I have to explain what this is. Part of the neoliberal programs has been to eliminate pensions, so people don't have security. What they are, they replace pensions by what are called 401k investments. So throw people into the market. You're a victim of market forces. You have no security. And it's very serious. I mean, happened with me. I don't have a pension. I have a 401k. So whatever the market does, I'm subject to it. Nobody has any idea what the investments are. That's way up there with some banker somewhere. So everybody's in the market. We've eliminated pensions. Now, what did Scalia do? He said private equity firms can enter the market for your 401ks. Private equity firms are predatory institutions who have only one function: to take over some business or something else, break it apart, and see how much money you can make out of it and destroy it. One of the curses of the neoliberal period. So now they can enter into what's left of the shreds of your pensions. Every time, every moment you look, something like this is being done. Shortly before that, there was an executive order saying that companies have to be protected if they force their workers back to work. So suppose some meatpacking company it demands that its workers come back to work. I don't know if you've ever seen a meatpacking plant, but it's horrible. And the pandemic, and it'll spread in 1 second. Everybody's standing right next to each other, working like a maniac, cutting up chickens and so on. So if they force their workers back to work, they can't, and the workers refuse, they can be punished. If they go back to work and get sick, the company is protected from any liability by government order. And that's a couple of weeks ago. Before that, it's something else. Other governments, reactionary governments, are doing the same kind of thing. You know what India's been doing. It's right on the surface. So these people are working relentlessly. Question is whether counter forces will develop to make sure they can't get away with it. So we're back to the same question. It's basically class war on an international scale, on an enormous scale. And one of the classes is very powerful, very wealthy, organized, relentless, knows exactly what it's doing. Problem is, will the rest of the world respond and overcome them? That's the situation we're now in. I should say the last book of mine, the title of it is Internationalism or Extinction. And I think that's exactly what we face. If we don't move towards a progressive form of internationalism, a human society will simply be destroyed.
The next question is on education. What will be the impact of COVID-19 on educational system around the world? Will the use of digital technology in education cause further marginalization of people and countries? What will be the collective goal response to each of those marginalized communities?
Interestingly, it's pretty much the same answer that I gave before. So let's be concrete. Again, we'll take the United States, by far the most important country in the world. The Secretary of Education is passionate, is a very rich, super rich family, very reactionary, strongly opposed to education. They want to destroy the public education system, turn it into private education, religious schools, schools for the elites, what are called charter schools, which take money from the public and set up privately controlled institutions. And this is Betty DeVos. She is using the cover of the pandemic to advance this program. There's a lot of stimulus money coming in from the government. It's supposed to go to to help people. About 80% of it is going to the corporate system. But she's using the part that goes to education to ensure that it doesn't go to public schools, but it goes to private schools to try to undermine public education. In the United States, this is a remarkable development. One of the great achievements of American democracy back in the 19th century was to pioneer mass public education. You didn't have that in Europe. You didn't have it in England. The United States essentially initiated this great program. It was one of the great achievements of the United States, now being destroyed by the Trump administration in the interests of private wealth and corporate power. Betsy DeVos, Secretary of Education, is the one doing it. Other countries, similar things are happening. Depends on the country. It's a big battle. Interestingly, in the United States, the labor movement has been pretty much crushed by the neoliberal programs, but it's reviving. And the revival began with teachers' strikes. Teachers around the country, some of them in very reactionary states, teachers organizing to try to demand more funding for schools. They're not just calling for wages, though they need that too, but funding for schools, so you don't have to have 60 kids sitting in a class. You know, you can have properly funded schools, you can have nurses, you can have educational consultants, you can have arts, all the things that have been taken away by the attacks on the public schools. So the teachers now are forming teachers unions in my own state, in Arizona, to try to force the legislature, education works by state, force the legislature to fund education properly. And they're having an impact. They have a lot of public support. So again, you have the same battle being waged on the local scale, on the national scale, everywhere you look. And the answer to what will happen depends on how this class war turns out.
The next question is, can the world really abandon relations with China, considering the vast trade dependency? If not, what would be China's political position in the world in days to come?
What will be China's position in the world?
Yes.
Well, there's a lot of talk about China becoming the next hegemonic power. It's very misleading. China has had enormous progress and economic progress in recent years. The poverty has been radically reduced. There are many more educational opportunities. Scientific institutions are developing. In some areas, China's in the lead in the world. Sustainable energy, for example, solar power, windmills, electrification, China's way ahead. And there is a lot of talk about, has been for years, about American decline, power shifting to Asia, to China and India. Very unlikely. China remains a poor country. If you take a look at the United Nations Human Development Index, which measures various aspects of a country's welfare, China's about 90th, I think. India's maybe 130th. These are poor countries with very serious problems. That's a pretty recent development, incidentally. You go back to the 18th century, China and India were the centers of economic power and social advancement. They were subject to imperial conquest, which devastated them. They're now sort of coming back, but they have a long way to go. You take a look at one of the measures of standard measures of power in the world is gross domestic product. How much is produced in the country? It's a very misleading measure. In these days of neoliberal globalization, that measure doesn't mean much. A much more reasonable measure is how much of world wealth is owned by multinational corporations in a particular country. So how much of world wealth is owned by corporations based in the United States? The answer to that is spectacular, 50%. 50% of world wealth is owned by US-based multinationals. In almost every category, they are first, sometimes second. Retail, in industry, agriculture, commerce. They're first almost everywhere. Take, say, China. China is the source of production for most of the world. If you have an iPhone, it was put together in China. China gets almost nothing from that, barely gets any of the profit. Much of the profit goes to Taiwan because the Taiwanese companies like Foxconn are organizing production for Apple Corporation in China. The vast majority of the profit comes to the United States, to the Apple Corporation, which has the design, the development, the management, and so on. So China gets something. Taiwan gets more. The United States gets most of it. And that's what you find in industry after industry. That aside, China has, and India also have very severe problems that the West doesn't have. Demographic problems, ecological problems, lack of agricultural resources, very serious problems. So I think China is surely going to be a major power in the world, but it's not going to be dominant. In fact, if you look at the military dimension, the United States is so far ahead that nobody's even in the game. The United States outspends the 10 most following countries, outspends them together, spends almost as much as the rest of the world, technologically much more advanced. It's declining. Trump is very seriously harming the United States. It's becoming a pariah state. Europe dislikes it. Other countries hate it. He's very seriously harming the United States. But even Trump can't destroy a country that's that powerful. Other countries may. Like, you take a look at the international press today. One of the lead stories, New York Times, other papers, is that Europe cannot understand why the United States is giving up any effort to deal with the pandemic. Almost every other country is doing important things. The United States is just letting it rage. In my own state where I live, Arizona, the governor, who's a Republican, lifted the lockdown because Trump says you have to. So coronavirus cases are spiking. It's now the worst in the country. It's as if Europe is looking at this and saying it's as if the country's gone crazy. They're not even trying to deal with a major crisis that already killed 100,000 people. They just want to let it rage and get worse. What's happening to that country? So it's losing respect, admiration. Europe, the rest of the world, hates a lot of things they're doing, but they're afraid. If the United States gives an order, they follow it. You see this over and over. Now take, say, Iran. The joint agreement on the nuclear program was working very effectively. US intelligence agreed, everybody agreed. Trump destroyed it because the only thing he can think of doing is wrecking things. So he destroyed it, imposed very harsh sanctions on Iran. The United States is the only country in the world that can impose sanctions. In fact, about a quarter of the world is under US sanctions. And when the US imposes sanctions, everybody has to obey them. Europe hates them, but they have to obey them, or they get thrown out of the international financial system. So Europe doesn't like the sanctions. They can't do anything about it. They have to abide by them. Other countries too. Another sign of US power. Trump is trying desperately to find some way to cover up for the fact that he's responsible for killing tens of thousands of Americans. He doesn't want people to see that, obviously. So he's trying to blame it on somebody else. One of the targets was the World Health Organization. So he's now pulled out of the World Health Organization, trying to destroy it. What does that mean, pulling out of the World Health Organization? What does it mean to people in Africa or in Yemen who depend on World Health Organization services for survival? They're suffering from all kinds of epidemics, even before the coronavirus hits. Support they're getting is from the World Health Organization. So here's this maniac in Washington who, in order to improve his electoral prospects, is deciding to kill, murder uncountable numbers of people in Africa, in Yemen, the worst humanitarian crisis of the world, other poor countries. Nobody can do anything about it because this country has the hammer. It can beat you on the head. Nobody can do anything. It's a horrible situation till it changes in the United States. It's going to be extremely dangerous for the whole world. But who's doing anything about it? Nobody very much. Too dangerous. That's the answer to the question whether China will be the hegemonic power. Not there's a lot to criticize in China. They do a lot of really rotten things, but they don't have the power to rule the world the United States does.
With World Health Organization, we have another question. How do you see the role of multilateral institutions in post-COVID-19 world order?
Multilateral institutions? Well, I mentioned the World Health Organization. Trump administration is trying to destroy it. What about the United Nations? This goes back to the beginning of the neoliberal period. The United States basically created the United Nations. But since Reagan, it's trying to destroy it. The United States stopped paying its dues. Some parts, like UNESCO, just refuses to pay anything. If any part of the United Nations doesn't follow US orders, the United States demolishes it. Ever since Reagan. Clinton's was the same. Obama was a little different, but not very much. Take something else. Take what's happening in Israel, Palestine. Very interesting. The United States came out with what it called the greatest deal of the century. It essentially destroys all Palestinian rights. It gives the ultra-right in Israel everything they want. Suppose somebody, that immediately, since it came from the United States, it became the basis for international discussion. So all international discussion now is how can we fix up the greatest deal of the century? Suppose some other country had come out of that. Suppose China had produced it, or Germany, or France, or India. Nobody would even looked at it. They would have laughed. If you even bothered with it, you'd throw it out. The United States comes out with it, you have to obey it. That's a sign of power, just like the sanctions and everything else I've mentioned. That's the way the world works. It's kind of like the mafia. There's a godfather. Everybody has to obey, otherwise you're in trouble. The world is not very far from that. Political scientists, international relations experts have a much prettier picture, make it look nice. But if you look at the way the world actually works, pretty much resembles this. There are international institutions. They work only insofar as the great powers permit them to, and the most important of them is the United States.
Professor, we have lots of questions, but I know it's almost midnight in Arizona. So let's end with the last question. Is there the possibility of second Cold War between China and the United States? The likelihood of such a confrontation leading to a hot war?
I'm sorry, but the sound stopped. I couldn't hear.
What is the possibility of second Cold War between China and the United States? What is the
second what?
Cold War, like Soviet and United States had. USSR and United States had Cold War. So
go to war?
Cold War.
We can very confidently predict that they're not going to go to war. That's the most confident prediction you can make. The reason is, if you turn out to be wrong, there won't be anybody around to say anything about it. So it's a safe prediction. But will it happen? It could. If you look over the record of the last 70 years carefully, there's no time to do it now, but it's a virtual miracle that we've survived. Just by accident, over and over, we've come to time very close to war. As the military systems grow and expand, as they're doing now, both Russia and the United States, mostly Trump's initiative, and as they move to more automated control systems, using artificial intelligence to control the response systems, the danger goes up. So it just purely by accident, it might happen. It's come very close in the past, sometimes also by just reckless actions of governments. Could go through that, but often just literally thousands of times by accident. So it's a very hazardous situation. The arms control regime has somewhat protected it. The INF Treaty, Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty in Europe, signed by Reagan and Gorbachev, that significantly reduced the threat of war, hence nuclear war in Europe. The Open Skies Treaty, initiated by President Eisenhower, reduced the threat that one of the two powers would mistake what's happening in the other and go to war by a first strike, reduced it. Trump has demolished both of them. The only one that's left is the New START Treaty, which keeps a lid on the number of nuclear weapons that the two nuclear states have. Russia has been asking for a year to renegotiate it. The White House has been refusing. They finally agreed a couple of days ago, but only by imposing an impossible condition that China has to join. It doesn't make any sense. The number of Chinese weapons is way below the minimum that the treaty can reach. So to insist that China comes in is just to say, let's block it somehow. In fact, Russia responded by saying, well, if China comes in, why not France? They have more nuclear weapons than China. So these are just ways of preventing it from happening. And if that treaty isn't signed, it's due next February, there's no more arms control system. So the danger of war sharply increases. United States builds more advanced weapons, Russia will build more advanced weapons to counter them. And here we are going off into outer space. So it's a very threatening situation. That's why the doomsday clock shifted to seconds, not minutes, because we're moving closer to termination. And meanwhile, polar ice caps are melting. The Antarctic glaciers are threatened. Sea level rise will make most of Bangladesh underwater, what happens then? Temperatures are rising to almost 50 degrees centigrade in parts of India. What happens then? It becomes unlivable. That's all going on. There's a monitor of the number of carbon dioxide particles in the atmosphere. It's done by a major institution in the United States. They just came out with their latest analysis. Keeps going up, escalating. There was a slight effect of the pandemic. It was so slight, it couldn't even register. They're warning that if we don't change this soon, we might approach the level of 3.5 million years ago, when sea levels were 50 to 80 feet, 20 meters higher than today. I mean, it's just unimaginable. And this doesn't happen in one step. It comes step by step. So that's the situation we're in. I'm afraid I have to leave.
Yes. Thank you, Professor.